Alright guys, welcome back to another leatherworking project. So for this one, we're going to be making an absolutely beautifully designed bag. Now, I did not design this. The plans for this bag come from Diesel Punk Row. And there will be a link to both where you can buy these plans as well as their YouTube channel where I learned how to make this bag in the description down below. I want to make that very clear from the beginning of this project that this project was designed by somebody else because it's very important to me to make sure that the appropriate person gets credit. With that out of the way, one of the reasons I chose to do this bag specifically out of all the different options that are out there is because I really liked a lot of the concepts. And just like when I started woodworking, my goal right now is to learn as many of the different basics of leatherworking as possible, specifically with bag making. And so what I'm trying to figure out right now is how to create the kind of very generic structure of a bag. So in our previous project where I made the Claridge leather roll top backpack, that one was quite a simplistic form. It was basically just a few pieces stitched into kind of a big circle. It was a very simple form of a bag, but I also really liked it. But with this bag, the structure is a little bit more complex. You've got a few more options added on to this bag, and mainly you've got a kind of a harder, more of a solid base to it, which again helps create a little bit more of a solid structured bag. So again, it's all about just experimenting and trying these different plans, and eventually when I get to designing my own bags and kind of my own projects, I'll have much more of an understanding of how to create the structure or the shape of a bag that I want. And so it's also why I really like in the beginning working off of other people's plans, because when you try to just start designing pieces when you're still trying to learn how to work with material, it can be very complicated. And this is the exact same thing I did when I got into woodworking. When I started with my woodworking, I bought a whole bunch of books and a few different sets of plans and that, and I built all these different projects and kind of learned the fundamentals. And one of the things I've so far found very interesting about leatherworking compared to woodworking is all about kind of straight structure. You're building kind of everything in woodworking comes down to basically being a box or a table. You know, it's minor differences, but everything is basically a box. Whereas in leatherworking, you know, everything is also basically a box. Like a bag is usually just in the shape of a box, but it's a much more organic shape. Your measurements in that don't have to be nearly as accurate as they do in woodworking, but also in other cases they have to be way more accurate. So it's a very interesting form of crafting because everything is kind of organic, everything is a little bit more free-flowing, and you also have to be able to account for that part too. Because again, in woodworking, you know, if you cut a piece to 12 inches long, it's going to be 12 inches long, and you know, over time with a little bit of wood movement, it might change, but overall it's going to stay at 12 inches. Whereas if I want a 12-inch wide bag, I have to somehow account for the seam allowances and the different stretch and all that. You know, there's a lot of different things you have to think about with this specific material that is very different from the way that my mind already thinks about woodworking. And for those of you that might be new to my videos, if this is the first one you're seeing, I'm a woodworker majority of the time, and I'm dabbling a little bit in leatherworking, which is why I'm trying to compare things to woodworking, because it's just one of those things that makes sense in my mind. But again, this is one of the things that has really made me want to get into leatherwork, is because it's a lot of similar ways of thinking to a lot of other things that I make, but I like the fact that it is so kind of open and organic. You know, you're following these natural shapes. You really have to work with the material in different ways. It's just a very interesting form of making things. And it's also just kind of a fun hobby to have on the side, you know, going along with my woodworking in that. Because one of the things I found, especially while I was working on this bag, is I was doing a lot of overtime during the week when I was working on this at my job. And when I was come home in the evenings, you know, I'd be pretty tired, but I still wanted to get out there and just sit in the shop and work on this bag. Because I could just go and sit there and just stitch. And this bag involved hours and hours of just sitting there stitching. And it was very painful. You know, I've got blisters all over my fingers, but overall, compared to even the last leather bag that I did, it wasn't actually that bad. And that also brings me to another very interesting thing that I learned about doing this bag compared to the last one. And that is that this bag is specifically designed to be hand stitched. The way that all of your different seams come together, personally, I don't know if you could do it with a sewing machine. I'd be interested to try, but the majority of the way that these different pockets and even the main body seams are all attached together, they're meant to be hand stitched, so that just changed things up a little bit. I also learned the really good lesson of using a much wider stitching pattern. I believe I'm using a 6mm one on this one, whereas on that other bag that I did, I used a 2mm stitching pattern. So pretty big difference there. It just meant a lot less stitches that I had to do and made everything go a little bit faster. But when I'm comparing that to the other bag was very much so designed to be put together on a sewing machine. You know, you've got all of your seams that run nice and straight with each other. You could very easily kind of run things through a sewing machine on a flat table and that, and it's a little bit easier to do in that way. So just comparing these different bags and having to think about how just the way that your seams come together, or how you might attach a pocket one way versus the other, and all depending on whether or not you want to hand stitch or use a sewing machine. And right now my sewing machine is currently sitting in a pile of just a whole bunch of parts, but once I get that thing up and running, it's going to be a very interesting process trying to learn how to make these different things. Because again, it's all about trying to figure out, just like woodworking, how to figure out what way you want to go about doing something. Sometimes working by hand is a little bit better, but sometimes using some machinery can be good because it can help speed you up. And again, that is one of the key things I'm trying to learn right now with leatherworking, is I really don't enjoy doing a ton of stitching, I don't think, but it's also one of those things where I do kind of enjoy it. Again, much like hand planing a board, sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's not. When you're sitting there and you're stitching for hours on end, it can get a little bit tedious. But if you are having some fun with it, you put on a movie and you can just kind of relax and work away at a project, it can actually be somewhat enjoyable. So as I'm looking to kind of start designing some of my own bags to start putting together, that's some of the things that I'm starting to kind of think about here. But this is one of my favorite parts of this bag specifically. So you can see here I'm cutting up some 8-ounce veg tan leather, and this is what's actually going to help add a ton of structure to this bag. Because so far the bag is basically just a tube. It's very loose, it's very flowy, much like the last bag I made. But as we go through and make this bottom piece, this is actually what creates that kind of rectangular structure to the bag. And I think this is one of the coolest designs and something I definitely want to use in my own projects in the future, because I do like how it creates that solid structure. The only downside to it is, again, going back to the lesson I was just talking about, doing the bottom like this, I believe you can only do it with hand stitching. I don't know if you could do this with a sewing machine, just because you have to kind of pull things together as you go. Again, as you can see here, that bottom piece is fairly rigid, so I kind of have to pull it and shape everything together as I'm stitching. And when I say this is one of the most challenging things I've ever done with leatherworking, I am not exaggerating. Trying to get all this shape together to fit that bottom piece and get your stitches nice and even, it was very challenging. But the structure that piece brings to the bag, I think, is just amazing. And again, I'm going to try using this in some of the bags that I design in the future because it just looks really cool. Now again, I want to talk a little bit more about the plans, because this really changed my way of kind of thinking about designing within leatherworking. Because as far as I really thought about it before, I thought you always kind of cut out your shapes, put your shapes together, and then you started doing your punching and all that. And what I really like about the way that Diesel Punk Row goes about designing their projects is they have all of this stuff pre-laid out. And I think that is very, very smart. I'm sure it comes with a lot of skill and a lot of practice and a lot of experimenting to make sure things are going to line up properly. But once you figure that out, it's actually a really smart way of doing things. Because one of the issues I've run into in the past when I've messed around with a little bit of leather is when you try to punch through too many layers with your little stitching irons, it can be really challenging because the piece wants to move around on you. It's just very annoying. Whereas here, all of the punching that I had to do was going through one piece of leather, and I was able to get very good, clean, and accurate stitching lines punched in, and then when I was doing my stitching, all of my holes were there and just kind of ready to go. So you were able to do a ton of prep work, and that kind of made each stage of this project really easy. And that's one of the things that I found very interesting, is how easy it was to make this bag. Now again, it's obviously not an easy thing to do. There does take a little bit of time and patience, and there is definitely a lot of learning required, but I never would have thought I would have been able to make a bag like this. But thanks to these plans, specifically in the way that they were laid out, I did actually find it very achievable to make this bag. It was also really fun being able to support another creator. Just by buying the plans, I know that I'm helping this creator, do what they want to do. And that's one of the things for me, being someone that is on the YouTube platform. It feels good whenever I can support other creators. And so again, if you guys are all interested in leatherwork, I highly recommend you go check out Diesel Punk Row. There will be a link in the description down below. Moving on to the last part of the project, this was the thing that made me want to make this bag. All the other parts of it were definitely awesome selling features, stuff that I would very much so looked at and analyzed before I decided which plans to buy. But these straps were very specifically the thing that made me go, yeah, this is the one I want to try making. Because this is the first bag or the first set of plans that I've seen that actually have padded leather straps. And I know that sounds kind of simple, right? It's not the most exciting thing, but for me, in the process of actually using a backpack, I think it's very important to figure out how to have some padding in those straps. Because in that first bag that I made, and I talked about this in that video, even though it's not a bag that is meant for, going on long hikes or anything, I do find that when I have that bag loaded up and I'm just taking it to work, those little 1-inch straps can be somewhat uncomfortable to carry. So this bag with these slightly padded straps, I just find it very interesting, and the whole process and the way that they were shaped is also just super cool. This top piece, that kind of dark brown leather piece, is rolled over on the edges, so you get this super nice delicate curves on these straps, and again, they just look really cool. And it's going to take some time to break them in because right now they're somewhat stiff, but I think that once those straps get broken in, this is going to be a super comfortable bag to carry around. But that's going to do it for this project, guys, so as always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.